Picture this. You're looking at a modern map, tracing the lines that separate one country from another. They seem so definite, so deliberate, as if they were always meant to be there. But what if I told you that many of these borders, these divisions we take for granted, were silently shaped centuries ago by a mysterious order of warrior monks? The Knights Templar, often remembered for their legendary treasures and dramatic downfall, left behind a hidden legacy that still influences our world today. Their network of fortresses and outposts, scattered across Europe and the Holy Land, didn't just vanish into history instead. They became the unseen foundations upon which modern nations built their boundaries. It's a story of unintended consequences, where military strategy and economic ambition accidentally sculpted the geopolitical landscape we recognize now. Think about the last time you crossed a border, whether on a road trip or just glancing at a map. That line on the paper or screen feels permanent, but its origins might stretch back to a Templar stronghold perched on a hilltop or guarding a river crossing. These medieval outposts were originally built to protect pilgrims and secure trade routes during the Crusades, yet their strategic placements created patterns of control and influence that would endure long after the order itself was dissolved. Kings and emperors, when drawing new maps and negotiating treaties, often found themselves following invisible lines first laid down by the Templars. The very soil under our feet, the rivers that divide regions, the mountains that mark frontiers, all of them whisper secrets of a time when these knights wielded power in ways they never could have imagined. In this video, we're going to unravel that hidden transformation, tracing how crumbling stone walls and forgotten charters evolved into the borders we see today. We'll journey from the sun-baked hills of the Holy Land to the misty countryside of England, from the rugged frontiers of Portugal to the heart of Europe, uncovering the subtle connections between Templar decisions and modern political realities. You'll discover how a single fortress could influence the fate of nations, how trade routes became territorial lines, and how legends woven around these sites reinforced the idea of where one land ends and another begins. This isn't just a tale of ancient history, it's a reminder that the past is always present, quietly shaping our world in ways we rarely stop to notice. So join me as we decode this fascinating story, and by the end, you might never look at a map the same way again. To grasp how a band of knights could leave such an indelible mark on the world's maps, we need to step back into the chaotic and fervent world of the early 1100s. The year 1119 marks their humble beginning, not in a grand palace but in the aftermath of the First Crusade. Jerusalem was in Christian hands, but the roads leading to it were perilous, plagued by bandits and rival factions. Into this dangerous void stepped a small group of knights, led by a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens. They took a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating themselves not to conquest but to protection. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name derived from their headquarters on Jerusalem's Temple Mount. Their mission was profoundly simple yet desperately needed: to ensure the safety of the countless pilgrims who traveled from Europe to visit the holy sites. This noble cause resonated powerfully across Christendom. Just 9 years after their founding, in 1129, they received the official endorsement of the Catholic Church at the Council of Troyes. This papal bull was a game-changer. It didn't just give them legitimacy, it placed them under the direct authority of the Pope himself, making them exempt from the control of local bishops and kings. This unique status was the first key that unlocked their meteoric rise. With the church's blessing, donations began to flood in. Wealthy nobles seeking spiritual favor gifted them vast tracts of land across Europe. Younger sons of aristocrats who stood to inherit no title or property joined the order in droves, bringing their military training and family connections with them. They weren't just receiving charity, they were building an empire of faith and finance. Their structure was revolutionary for its time. They became the world's first multinational corporation, a truly international organization with a centralized command that reported directly to the Pope. A knight born in England could be stationed in Cyprus, then transferred to Aragon, all while remaining part of the same rigid hierarchy. This network allowed for the seamless transfer of wealth, information, and manpower across continents. They innovated early forms of banking, allowing pilgrims to deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in London and withdraw them in Jerusalem using a coded letter of credit, a system that protected them from theft on the long journey. This financial genius, combined with their vast landholdings, made them incredibly wealthy, funding the construction of a chain of formidable fortresses. These weren't just castles, they were strategic nodes in a vast and interconnected system. Each outpost was placed with meticulous care, controlling mountain passes, river crossings, and vital harbors. They were built to dominate the landscape both physically and economically. A Templar castle could secure a valley, protect a trade route, and administer the surrounding farmland, all while answering to a distant command center. This created a web of controlled territory that often existed outside the traditional feudal structures of kings and counts. They were creating de facto borders within borders, zones of Templar influence that operated under their own laws and logistics. This immense power, however, would eventually sow the seeds of their destruction, making kings envious and debtors fearful. But long after the order was gone, the geographical footprint of their network, the locations of their forts, the routes they secured, the boundaries of their estates remained etched into the landscape, waiting to be adopted by the nation-states that would rise in the centuries to come. To truly grasp the significance of a single Templar outpost, we must journey to the rugged highlands of Galilee, where the air is thin and the views stretch for miles. Here, perched atop a strategic hill some 850 meters above sea level, stood the formidable fortress of Safed. Its story begins not with the Templars, but with its initial construction by the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1140s. However, it was after its recapture from Saladin's forces in 1240 that the Knights Templar truly transformed it. They didn't just rebuild the castle, they engineered a masterpiece of medieval military architecture, creating one of the largest and most formidable strongholds in the entire Holy Land. Its sheer scale was staggering, with an outer wall boasting 7 massive towers and an inner keep that could garrison a garrison of over 2,000 men. But its purpose extended far beyond its intimidating walls. Safed's immense value lay in its unparalleled vantage point. From its ramparts, the Templar garrison could monitor the entire Upper Galilee region, keeping a watchful eye on the vital trade corridor that ran from the port city of Acre inland to Damascus. This wasn't just about watching for enemy armies, it was about controlling the flow of goods, people, and information. The castle became a nexus, a secure hub where Eastern spices, silks, and knowledge met Western pilgrims, merchants, and crusaders. The Templars, in their role as protectors, levied taxes and provided safe passage, effectively governing the economic lifeblood of the area. This economic control created a de facto territory, a zone of Templar influence whose boundaries were defined not by a king's decree, but by the reach of their patrols and the extent of their commercial agreements with local Muslim emirs and Christian settlers. This administrative role forced the Templars into a delicate and unprecedented form of diplomacy. To manage the region around Safed, they had to constantly negotiate with their Muslim neighbors, establishing tacit agreements on grazing rights, water access, and even spheres of control. These were some of the earliest, most pragmatic examples of cross-border negotiation in a region defined by religious conflict. They were drawing invisible lines in the sand, creating a working, functional frontier based on mutual interest rather than outright conquest. This pragmatic approach to territorial management established a template for how to administer a contested borderland, a lesson that would not be forgotten even after the castle's fall. That fall came in 1266, after a brutal siege by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. The fortress was so strong it withstood a full month of bombardment and assault before finally capitulating. The Mamluks, recognizing its supreme strategic value, did not simply destroy it. They rebuilt and reinforced it, making it a key administrative center of their own empire. In doing so, they largely preserved the existing territorial framework the Templars had established. The district of Safed, with its boundaries and internal logic, remained a coherent unit. This continuity is the key to understanding its lasting influence. When the Ottoman Empire conquered the region centuries later, they too adopted this pre-existing administrative division, the Sanjak of Safed, further cementing its place on the map. This legacy stretched all the way into the 20th century. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, the victorious Allied powers were tasked with drawing new borders across the Middle East. The British, who received the mandate for Palestine, often relied on existing Ottoman administrative boundaries to define the new territory they were to govern. In the north, the borders of the British Mandate for Palestine, and later the Armistice Lines of 1948 that would form part of Israel's northern frontier, subtly echoed the centuries-old jurisdiction once overseen from the ramparts of the Templar castle. The stone walls may have crumbled, but the ghost of the territorial entity they created lingered on, a silent testament to how a medieval fortress could, through sheer strategic persistence, cast a shadow that fell across modern maps. While the fortress of Safed represented the Templars' military might on a turbulent frontier, their influence was equally profound in the peaceful, rolling farmlands of England. Here, far from the battlefields of the Holy Land, the Order demonstrated a different kind of power, economic and administrative mastery. In the county of Lincolnshire, amid fields that stretched toward the North Sea, stood Temple Brewer. Unlike the soaring stone castles of the Levant, this was a preceptory, a regional headquarters designed not for siege warfare but for managing a vast and profitable agricultural empire. Established around the middle of the 12th century, its name itself, Brewer, thought to be derived from an old word for heath or wasteland, hints at its original purpose. The Templars were not just landowners, they were pioneers of land reclamation, turning what was often marginal, underused ground into highly productive and lucrative estates. The operation at Temple Brewer was a marvel of medieval efficiency. It functioned as the central hub for a network of surrounding farms, granges, and smaller holdings. From here, Templar officials, often known as preceptors, oversaw a diverse portfolio of activities. Vast flocks of sheep grazed on the Lincolnshire wolds, their wool becoming one of the Order's most valuable commodities, destined for lucrative export to the textile markets of Flanders. They managed arable land growing wheat and barley, operated mills to process the grain, and maintained fish ponds to provide protein for the community. This wasn't subsistence farming. It was a large-scale, integrated agribusiness designed to generate a steady and immense cash flow to fund their operations thousands of miles away. To manage this enterprise, they needed precise and unchanging definitions of what they owned. This necessity led to one of their most significant, if understated, contributions: the meticulous surveying and documentation of their properties. The boundaries of Temple brewers' estates were not vague notions. They were painstakingly delineated using a mixture of natural features and man-made markers. A charter might define a property line as running from a specific ancient oak tree to a prominent standing stone, then along the bank of a stream until it met a roadway built by the Romans. These descriptions were recorded in detailed documents, creating an early and remarkably accurate system of land registry. This practice effectively carved out distinct micro-territories across the English countryside, small sovereign domains where the Templars' law, not the local sheriffs, held ultimate sway. They created islands of administrative order that existed within, but somewhat apart from, the Kingdom of England. When the order was suddenly dissolved in the early 14th century, these well-defined and valuable properties did not simply vanish. They were seized by the crown and, in many cases, quickly granted to other powerful nobles or institutions, most commonly the Knights Hospitaller, the Templars' rivals. Crucially, the new owners inherited the land as it was. There was no great remapping or redistribution. The existing boundaries, so carefully established by the Templars for centuries, were simply adopted. Why would a new baron or a Hospitaller knight bother to redraw the lines around a perfectly good set of farms that were already turning a profit? They wouldn't. The physical and legal framework remained intact. Over subsequent centuries, as England's own internal administration became more formalized, these ancient Templar boundaries proved incredibly durable. When the kingdom was divided into shires and then into parishes for ecclesiastical and civil governance, the lines often followed the existing outlines of these great estates. The parish boundary of a village church might very well trace the exact same path that a Templar surveyor walked 500 years earlier. The foundations of the local had been set by the global ambitions of a military order. The story of Temple Brewer is a powerful lesson in how economic infrastructure can be just as formative as military conquest. The borders they shaped were not lines on a map of nations, but the invisible lines between fields, parishes, and counties, the very building blocks of the local landscape that people lived within every day. This quiet, bureaucratic legacy of land management reveals a subtler, yet equally pervasive, method through which the Templars left their mark on the modern world. While the English countryside saw the Templars mastering the art of agrarian economics, the story takes a dramatically different turn on the sun-scorched battlefields of the Iberian Peninsula. Here, in what would become Portugal, the order was engaged in a centuries-long holy war known as the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of land from Muslim Moorish rule. It was in this fiery crucible of conflict that the fortress of Tomar was born, not just as a castle, but as a seed from which an entire nation would eventually grow. King Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, gifted this strategic territory to the Templars in the mid-12th century with a very clear and urgent mission: to secure the vulnerable southern frontier of his fledgling kingdom along the Tagus River. The Moors were a constant threat, and the king needed the best military engineers and most disciplined warriors he could find. The Templars, fresh from their experiences in the Holy Land, were the obvious choice. They chose the site for Tomar with their signature strategic brilliance, placing it on a hill overlooking the Nabao River. This wasn't just a defensive position, it was a statement of permanent intent. The original structure, the Charola, is a stunningly unique piece of architecture, a massive 16-sided oratory modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It served as both a spiritual heart and an impregnable redoubt, symbolizing the inseparable fusion of faith and warfare that defined their purpose. From this powerful epicenter, the Templars didn't just defend a line on a map, they actively pushed that line southward. They were granted unprecedented authority over a vast swath of territory known as a cauto, a borderland where they had the power to settle disputes, collect taxes, and administer justice. In essence, they were the law, they were the border. This role transformed the Templar Knights into something more than soldiers. They became diplomat lords, constantly negotiating the volatile frontier with the neighboring kingdom of Leon and the Moorish Taifas to the south. The boundaries they negotiated and the treaties they signed were not temporary ceasefires but formative acts of statecraft. They were literally drawing the lines that would one day be recognized as the eastern border of Portugal. Their success in securing and settling this region provided the stability and security that allowed the young Portuguese kingdom to consolidate its power and identity, focusing its expansion south and eventually outward across the oceans. The Order's dissolution in the 14th century presented a crisis for Portugal, but King Diniz found an ingenious solution. To preserve their vital military and administrative assets, he simply created a new order right on the spot, the Order of Christ. He transferred all the Templar properties, wealth, and even many of its members into this new organization, with Tomar as its headquarters. This wasn't an end, it was a rebranding. The legacy of the Templars, their infrastructure, and their border-making expertise flowed uninterrupted into this new entity. The Knights of the Order of Christ, often led by members of the royal family like Prince Henry the Navigator, would then use Tomar as the financial and spiritual engine for Portugal's age of discoveries. The same wealth generated from those Templar-founded estates funded the caravels that sailed around Africa to India. The same cross that adorned the Templar mantle became the sail emblem of those explorers, planting Portuguese flags on new continents. The fortress itself expanded over the centuries into the magnificent Convent of Christ, a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose architecture tells the entire story, from the martial Romanesque of the original Templar castle to the extravagant Manueline style that celebrates the maritime empire it helped create. The boundaries first secured by the Templars became the unchanging core of the Portuguese nation-state, one of the oldest and most stable in Europe. Tomar stands as perhaps the most profound example of a Templar outpost evolving beyond its original military function to become a permanent cornerstone of a national identity, its influence radiating from a hilltop in Portugal to the farthest reaches of the globe. But the true genius of the Templar system wasn't just in the strength of its individual castles or the productivity of its farms. It was in the invisible threads that connected them all. Picture a vast medieval internet, not of data, but of stone, steel, and human ambition. This was the Templar network, a sprawling web of commanderies, preceptories, and fortresses that stretched from the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean to the misty coasts of the Baltic Sea. Each location was a node in this system, meticulously placed to serve a dual purpose, as a defensive stronghold and as a hub in a revolutionary logistics chain. A knight or a shipment of silver could travel from London to Jerusalem, moving from one Templar house to the next, always under the Order's protection and authority. This created a level of connectivity and security that was utterly unprecedented in the fragmented world of medieval Europe. This network did something remarkable to the very concept of borders. In an age where frontiers were often vague, contested zones of influence, the Templar system created corridors of clarity and control. Their protected routes became the safest and most reliable ways to travel, effectively funneling trade and diplomacy along these predetermined paths. Over time, these pathways began to solidify. the land surrounding a Templar-patrolled road gained value and stability, attracting settlement and commerce. In this way, the Templars weren't just operating within existing borders, they were actively creating new economic and logistical realities that would later be formalized into political boundaries. They were drawing lines on the map not with treaties but with traffic, the constant movement of people and goods that gradually etched their preferred routes into the landscape. What makes this system so fascinating is its unique blend of uniformity and flexibility. Every Templar house, from a small preceptory in rural Germany to a major commandery in Paris, answered to the same central hierarchy and followed the same core rules. They all used similar architectural plans for their buildings, the same financial ledgers, and the same chain of command. This created a recognizable Templar brand across the continent. Yet, each node was also incredibly adaptive. A commandery in the wine-rich region of Languedoc would focus on managing vineyards and exporting barrels, while one in the German marches would be geared toward military recruitment and border defense against Slavic tribes. They took on the color of their local environment, creating these unique hybrid jurisdictions that were both part of a global order and deeply rooted in their immediate locality. This adaptable model proved incredibly resilient, even after the order itself was destroyed. When King Philip IV of France moved to crush the Templars in 1307, he wasn't just arresting monks, he was attempting to dismantle a state within a state. The properties were seized, but the underlying infrastructure was far too valuable to simply discard. The physical buildings, the stout commanderies with their fortified walls and strategic locations were too useful. The carefully managed farmlands were too productive. The well-documented road networks were too efficient. New owners, whether rival orders like the Hospitallers or local nobles, simply moved in and took over the existing operation. They inherited the walls, the fields, and the well-worn paths between them. When the modern nation-states began to coalesce in the centuries that followed, their administrators looked at the map and saw a landscape already organized into coherent units. The old Templar territories, with their clear boundaries and established economic roles, provided a ready-made template for the new civil parishes, counties, and even national frontiers. The systemic impact of this network is the hidden key to understanding their legacy. It wasn't about one castle influencing one border. It was about an entire organizational model for controlling territory and movement being absorbed into the DNA of modern Europe. This web of influence ensured that long after the last Templar knight was gone, the ghost of their network continued to guide the hand of the mapmaker, shaping the continents from the shadows. Yet to view the Templars merely as holy warriors or landlords is to miss a crucial dimension of their power. They were, at their heart, brilliant economic strategists. Their network of fortresses functioned less like a chain of isolated castles and more like a string of highly secure, interconnected warehouses and banks. They understood that true, lasting influence came not just from controlling land, but from controlling the flow of wealth across that land. Their outposts were almost always positioned with an economist's eye, planted squarely atop the most vital commercial crossroads of the medieval world. A mountain passed through the Alps, a shallow river crossing on a major thoroughfare, a natural harbor along a bustling coastline. These were the jewels in their crown. By occupying these pinch points, they didn't just defend territory, they monetized movement itself. At these strategic nodes, the Templars provided a service that every merchant craved: security. Travel in the Middle Ages was an incredibly risky venture, with bandits, rogue lords, and rival armies constantly threatening cargo and lives. A merchant caravan approaching a Templar-controlled pass knew that for a fee, a toll, or a percentage of the goods, they would receive safe passage. Templar knights would patrol the route, their fearsome reputation alone often enough to deter would-be attackers. They might even provide armed escorts for particularly valuable shipments. In return, the order grew immensely wealthy, collecting a steady stream of revenue that was far more reliable and sustainable than the spoils of occasional warfare. This system created powerful economic incentives for stability. A chaotic, war-torn border was bad for business. Both the Templars and the local rulers who benefited from this trade had a shared interest in calming a region, in formalizing agreements, and in creating predictable, safe zones for commerce to flourish. This activity began to subtly redraw the map. These secure trade routes, frequented by merchants and protected by the order, started to function as informal economic corridors. The land surrounding them gained value. Towns and markets sprang up to service the constant traffic. Over generations, these corridors solidified into recognized pathways, and the zones of economic activity around them began to coalesce into distinct regions. The Templar-controlled route from the French port of Marseille, for instance, wasn't just a road to the Holy Land. It was an economic engine that linked the markets of Provence with the riches of the Levant. The communities along this route developed shared interests, traded with one another, and began to see themselves as part of a coherent economic bloc. Centuries later, when modern states like France and Italy began to formalize their borders, they often did so by following the outlines of these pre-existing, economically integrated regions. The invisible lines of commerce, first nurtured by Templar protection, had hardened into political reality. Supporting this vast commercial empire required a level of record-keeping that was revolutionary for its time. The Templars became meticulous accountants, developing sophisticated financial instruments to manage their wealth. They kept detailed ledgers tracking income from tolls, rents, and donations across their entire network. They issued letters of credit, allowing a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem, a system that required incredible coordination and trust between distant commanderies. To manage their sprawling properties and plan their logistics, they also became pioneers of practical cartography. Their maps, while not always geographically perfect in the modern sense, were functional documents that clearly marked their properties, the routes between them, and the natural features that defined their boundaries. These financial and cartographic records became a hidden treasure trove for the emerging nation-states of the Renaissance. When kings sought to inventory the wealth of their realm, to tax its people, or to definitively map their territories, they often turned to the archives inherited from the Templars and their successor orders. The detailed surveys of a place like Tempelbruer provided a blueprint for how to manage a large estate. The route maps showing the path from Marseille offered a template for where to build royal highways and place customs houses. The Templars had, entirely for their own purposes, developed the early tools of modern territorial management, standardized accounting, systematic land surveys, and logistical planning. The new centralized state simply adopted and scaled these tools, embedding the Templars' logistical and economic frameworks into the very fabric of how modern countries would administer their borders and economies. Their greatest legacy, therefore, may not be in the stones of their castles, but in the ledgers and maps that taught Europe how to organize itself. This unique legal status transformed every Templar commandery into something far more significant than just a monastery or a castle. It became a pocket of sovereignty. Imagine a traveler in 13th century France moving from the lands of a local count, where the count's law applied, into a territory owned by the Templars. They would effectively be crossing an invisible border. They were now in a place where the local sheriff had no authority, where the taxes they might owe went not to the king but to the Templar treasury, and where any dispute would be settled by Templar officials in a Templar court based on their own set of rules. This created a patchwork of semi-independent states within states, a proto-border system that challenged the traditional feudal idea of seamless, hierarchical authority from king down to peasant. The boundaries of these zones weren't marked by fences or walls, but they were very real in the minds of the people and in the legal documents of the era. The power to hold their own courts was perhaps their most revolutionary privilege. Templar justice wasn't administered by a local lord who might be swayed by family ties or personal grudges. It was delivered by appointed brothers of the order who followed a standardized written code. This offered a surprising degree of fair and consistent justice, attracting settlers to their lands who sought refuge from the often arbitrary rule of local nobility. Disputes over property lines between farmers, conflicts between merchants at a Templar-run market, even minor criminal acts, all were adjudicated internally. This judicial autonomy required them to become masters of documentation. Every ruling, every land transaction, every boundary agreement was meticulously recorded and stored in their archives. They were creating a body of precedent and a system of administrative law that operated in parallel to the royal systems developing around them. Their approach to defining the land itself was equally systematic and would leave a lasting imprint on cartography. While a local baron might define his estate's edge as from the big oak tree to the rocky outcrop, the Templars took this several steps further. Their charters and land surveys are remarkable for their precision and detail. A typical Templar boundary description might read something like, beginning at the ancient standing stone north of the village mill, proceeding 40 paces east to the fork in the stream, following the southern branch for 200 paces until it meets the old Roman road, then westward along the road for 150 paces to the hawthorn hedge marked with the cross. This method of using a combination of permanent natural features and durable man made markers created a clear, unambiguous, and defendable definition of property. It was a practical system designed to prevent the constant border squabbles that plagued medieval Europe. This meticulousness did not go unnoticed, as royal governments began to grow stronger and sought to extend their control over their entire kingdoms. They faced a formidable challenge: how to accurately map, tax, and administer all the land under their nominal rule. The chaotic and overlapping claims of the feudal system were a bureaucratic nightmare. In their quest for order, royal surveyors and lawyers often looked to the best practices already in existence. And there, in the well-ordered lands of the former Templar estates, they found a working model. The techniques the Templars had perfected, the detailed surveys, the precise boundary descriptions, the thorough written deeds, were exactly what the emerging nation-state needed. The influence of this Templar template can be seen in some of the most important surveying projects of the late medieval and early modern periods. When England undertook the massive task of documenting all landholdings in the Domesday Book, and later when the Crown began to systematically define parish and county boundaries, the methods used bore a striking resemblance to those found in older Templar records. The idea that a border should be a clearly defined, legally documented line on a map, rather than a vague zone of influence, was powerfully advanced by the Order's practices. Their commanderies became inadvertent laboratories where the principles of modern territorial administration were tested and refined. Long after the Templars were gone, the bureaucratic machinery they helped pioneer was adopted by the very kingdoms that had absorbed their lands, providing the essential tools for drawing the orderly borders we recognize on the map today. Beyond their legal and economic influence, the Templars left a physical legacy carved in stone and mortar, one that would literally set boundaries for centuries to come. Their buildings were not merely functional shelters, they were powerful statements of permanence and control, strategically positioned to dominate the landscape. When a Templar commandery was constructed, it was placed with an almost supernatural sense of geography, often perched on the highest available ground or situated at the precise point where one lord's territory ended and another's began. These formidable structures, with their thick walls and imposing gatehouses, became the most reliable and unchanging features in a world where borders were often just vague understandings. For mapmakers and administrators in later eras, these surviving stone sentinels provided the only fixed points from which to begin the difficult task of drawing definitive lines. Consider the practical challenge of defining a border in the Middle Ages. Without satellites or precise surveying equipment, how did you show a farmer where his king's land ended and his neighbor's began? You used what was already there. A Templar castle built to last for eternity was the perfect marker. Its location was unambiguous, its ownership was a matter of public record, and its physical presence was impossible to ignore. A boundary description might simply state that the border ran from the Templar Tower at X to the river fork at Y. This practice turned their architecture into a permanent part of the surveying toolkit. The choice of building materials itself played a role. While local manor houses were often built of wood and thatch, Templar structures were made of cut stone, designed to withstand sieges and the slow decay of time. This durability meant that long after the order was gone, their ruins still stood, stubbornly refusing to vanish and continuing to serve as immutable reference points on the landscape. The story of La Couvertoirade in southern France is a perfect illustration of this phenomenon. Originally a remote outpost in the harsh limestone plateau of the Larzac, the Templars fortified this village in the 13th century, complete with a sturdy keep and a commanding circuit of walls. Its primary role was to protect the pilgrimage routes crossing this sparse region and to manage the vast herds of sheep that grazed there. Its position was not random, it was a calculated placement on the frontier of their influence. For generations, the walls of La Couvertoirade defined the effective limit of Templar control in that area. After the Order's dissolution, the village and its fortifications were taken over by the Knights Hospitaller, who maintained its role. Centuries later, when French royal administrators were formalizing the internal boundaries of the Languedoc region, the existence of this well-defined fortified town made it a natural anchor point. The borders they drew for the new administrative diocese subtly acknowledged the ancient sphere of influence that the stone walls of La Couvertoirade had proclaimed for hundreds of years. This process of repurposing was common across Europe. A Templar church in a bustling town might be converted into a municipal hall, its authority seamlessly transferring from a religious military order to a secular civic government. A lonely commandery on a river, once used to collect tolls for the order, could easily be converted into a royal customs house, its original economic function preserved and amplified by the state. The architectural language of these buildings, their defensive moats, imposing gatehouses and fortified towers, was a universal language of power and exclusion. A moat didn't just keep out invaders, it physically and symbolically separated one space from another. A high wall created a clear inside and outside. Later generations inheriting these structures understood this language intuitively. By choosing to reuse a Templar building for a new administrative purpose, they were unconsciously reaffirming the old territorial claims embedded in its stones, allowing the architectural ghosts of the order to continue dictating the lines of modern maps. But beyond the physical stones and legal charters, the Templars achieved something even more enduring. They became legends. Over the centuries, their history faded into myth, and these myths, in turn, began to shape the very idea of the land itself. In the collective imagination of countless communities across Europe, the Templars were no longer just historical figures. They were transformed into archetypal guardians, spectral sentinels who stood watch over the frontiers of the homeland. This cultural alchemy turned crumbling ruins into powerful national symbols, and those symbols subtly reinforced the perception of where one country ended and another began. A border is not just a line on a map, it is a story that people tell themselves about who they are and where they belong. The Templars, perhaps unintentionally, provided some of the most compelling chapters in those stories. Consider the rugged highlands of Scotland. After the Order's suppression, romantic tales spread that fugitive Templar knights had fled to Scotland, fought alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn, and became the hidden protectors of the Scottish crown. While the historical evidence for this is thin, the power of the story is immense. It wove the Templars directly into the fabric of Scottish resistance against English domination, casting them as defenders of Scottish sovereignty and the very integrity of the northern border. This narrative imbued the landscape with a sense of ancient, defiant identity. A viewer looking at the borderlands between Scotland and England might see rolling hills, but a believer in the myth might also see the ghostly outlines of Templar guardians, a psychological barrier as real as any wall. This legendary past provided a deep, historical justification for a separate Scottish nation, strengthening the cultural and political resolve to maintain a distinct border long after the medieval wars were over. A similar process unfolded in Poland. Here, Templar legends often cast the knights as brave defenders of Christendom's eastern flank against pagan incursions. Their commanderies were remembered not just as military outposts, but as bastions of civilization holding back the wilderness. This narrative became especially potent during the partitions of Poland in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the country was erased from the map by its powerful neighbors. In this time of national crisis, the folklore of the Templars as resilient border guardians offered a powerful metaphor for survival and eventual rebirth. It created a mental map of a Poland that had historically existed as a distinct, defensible entity, with its frontiers guarded by heroic figures. This cultural memory provided a template for what the nation should look like once it was restored, influencing the thinking of diplomats and nationalists when they finally had the chance to redraw the maps after World War I. The stories gave a historical depth and emotional weight to the demand for specific territorial boundaries. This transformation of history into myth is a powerful force in border formation. A mental map is the internal picture we all carry of our world, a blend of fact, memory, and story. For generations, the tales told about Templar sites of their bravery, their secrets, their unwavering defense of the land shaped these mental maps for entire populations. A river wasn't just a river, it was the line the Templars held. A mountain pass wasn't just a geographic feature, it was a gateway they once guarded. When the time came for actual border negotiations, these deeply ingrained mental maps forged in folklore provided a subconscious guide. Diplomats and surveyors, often themselves products of these cultures, would naturally gravitate towards boundaries that felt historically right or significant, lines that had been sanctified by legend and story long before they were ever etched onto parchment by treaty. The symbolic weight of these sites thus contributed to the psychological bedrock of modern nations. A border needs more than just a soldier or a fence to make it real. It needs the belief of the people on both sides of it. The myths surrounding the Templars provided a form of intangible heritage that helped manufacture that belief. They created a sense of historical inevitability about certain territorial arrangements, making them seem ancient, natural, and justified. This process shows us that the political reality of a border can indeed emerge from the hazy realm of stories and symbols. The stones of their outposts may have defined the initial physical points of control, but it was the stories told about those stones that truly cemented their place in the geographical imagination of Europe. proving that a legend can be just as effective as a law in drawing a line in the sand. Now let's zoom in on a specific stretch of land where the Templar legacy is etched directly into a modern international frontier: the rugged, beautiful, and often contentious border between France and Spain. The Pyrenees Mountains have always been a natural barrier, but for centuries they were also a chaotic frontier zone, a place where the Kingdom of France and the Crown of Aragon jostled for control, their influence waxing and waning with the fortunes of war and marriage. Into this volatile mix stepped the Knights Templar, and their primary stronghold in this region was not a towering castle, but a more subtle yet equally powerful center known as Mas Deu, which translates fittingly to House of God. Located in the rich plains of Roussillon, just north of the Pyrenees, Mas Deu was less a military bulwark and more a grand agricultural estate and diplomatic headquarters. It was from this peaceful-looking commandery that the Order exerted an influence far greater than its garrisons might suggest. The true power of the Templars in the Pyrenees lay in their unique position as neutral intermediaries. Both the French king and the Aragonese crown trusted them precisely because their primary allegiance was to the Pope in Rome, not to any local monarch. This granted them a rare credibility that allowed them to move freely across the emerging political fault lines. When disputes flared over grazing rights for sheep in the high mountain passes, it was often Templar officials from Mas Deu who were called upon to arbitrate. When a local noble's territory was ambiguous, the Templars' meticulous surveys and charters were consulted as a trusted source of truth. They brokered temporary truces, guaranteed safe passage for merchants, and even facilitated the exchange of prisoners. Through these countless small acts of mediation, they were effectively drawing invisible lines of agreement on a landscape that had known only conflict. They weren't conquering territory, they were building a framework for stability, creating a de facto buffer zone where their word was law and their presence ensured a fragile peace. This patient work of border building through diplomacy created a lasting template. The agreements they brokered, the property lines they so carefully documented, and the cross-border economic zones they managed established a precedent for how this rugged territory could be administered. Centuries later, when the kingdoms of France and Spain were exhausted by the 30 Years' War, they sat down to negotiate the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659. The diplomats who drew the new, formal border did not do so on a blank slate. They looked at the historical realities on the ground. They looked at long-standing territorial divisions, many of which could be traced back to the administrative boundaries first established and maintained by the Templars of Mas Deu and other nearby commanderies. The treaty didn't create a new border out of thin air. It largely formalized and recognized the existing, practical divisions that had been operating for centuries, divisions that the Templars had played a key role in shaping and stabilizing. Perhaps the most fascinating and enduring legacy of this Templar influence is the unique cultural region that straddles this border. The Order's ability to operate on both sides fostered a remarkable degree of cultural and linguistic exchange. They facilitated trade, which meant people, ideas, and traditions flowed more freely through the Pyrenean passes they controlled. This helped create a shared identity in this borderland, distinct from the powerful capitals of Paris and Madrid. Even today, this region has a unique character. Think of Catalonia, which spans both France and Spain, with its own language and culture. This cross-border identity, which can sometimes be a source of political tension, has its roots in the medieval period when the Templars and other orders treated the mountains not as a wall to be sealed, but as a connective space to be managed. Their legacy is a living one, felt in the bilateral relations between two powerful European nations, reminding us that borders are not just lines of separation, but also places of meeting and mixture, a concept the Templars understood and practiced long before modern diplomats gave it a name. While the Pyrenees showcased Templar diplomacy, a far more confrontational and transformative process was unfolding over 1,000 miles to the northeast, along the winding path of the Oder River. Here, in the contested frontier between the Holy Roman Empire and the Slavic world, the Templars took on a role that was less about mediating between established powers and more about actively creating new ones. Their commanderies, such as the fortified outposts at Lietzen and Rurka, were not merely strongholds, they were the sharp end of a spear, part of a vast project known as the Ostsiedlung, or the Eastward Settlement. This was a deliberate, organized effort to push the boundaries of Christendom and Germanic influence into lands traditionally held by West Slavic tribes like the Pomeranians and the Poles. The Templars, with their military discipline and papal backing, became ideal agents for this colossal endeavor of colonization and cultural transformation. The process was both military and agricultural. A commandery like the one at Rurka in Pomerania was established on land granted by a local duke eager to strengthen his own power by importing these formidable warrior monks. The Templars would first secure the area, building a fortified complex to serve as a secure base. Then, the real work began. They would initiate large-scale land reclamation projects, draining marshes and clearing dense forest tasks that required significant resources and an organized workforce that local rulers often lacked. This newly arable land was then systematically parceled out to settlers recruited from German-speaking lands to the west. These farmers, offered favorable terms and the protection of the Templar garrison, would establish new villages around the commandery, creating a thriving, defensible German-speaking enclave in the midst of a Slavic majority region. The commandery became the administrative, economic, and judicial center for this new colonial territory, effectively carving out a small piece of Germany in what is now modern Poland. This activity had a profound and lasting impact on the demographic and cultural map of the region. The Templars, and later the Teutonic Order, which absorbed many of their assets and continued their mission, were not just building castles, they were fundamentally altering the human landscape. They created a patchwork of ethnically German settlements that stretched along the river valleys, creating a demographic fact on the ground that would shape politics for centuries. The border between Germanic and Slavic realms was no longer a vague, shifting line through wilderness. It was now a complex, interlocking mosaic of communities, with the commanderies acting as the central nodes of German control and culture. The administrative boundaries the Templars drew to manage their estates and parishes became deeply ingrained, forming the underlying skeleton for later territorial divisions. When the Templar Order was dissolved, their extensive properties and their ongoing colonial project in the East were seamlessly transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, and more significantly, the Teutonic Knights. This military order, even more fervently dedicated to the conquest and conversion of the Baltic region, aggressively expanded upon the foundations the Templars had laid. The territorial structures first established by the Templars, the networks of villages, the managed estates, the defined jurisdictions were absorbed and amplified, eventually coalescing into the powerful and independent state of the Teutonic Order. This state, in turn, became the core of the later Kingdom of Prussia, a German power whose very identity was forged on this eastern frontier. The borderlands shaped by the Templars thus became the heartland of a future empire. The legacy of this medieval colonization echoes powerfully and painfully in the modern era, most notably in the form of the Oder-Neisse line. This river boundary, which today defines the border between Germany and Poland, is a direct consequence of the demographic and political shifts that began with the Ostsiedlung. After World War II, the Allies redrew the map of Europe, pushing Poland westward and assigning it vast tracts of land that had been German for centuries, in part as compensation for territory they lost to the Soviet Union in the east. The new border was formalized along the Oder and Neisse rivers, but its underlying logic acknowledged the ancient, tangled history of the region. The mass expulsion of ethnic Germans from these lands after the war was a brutal attempt to resolve a demographic situation that the Templars and Teutonic Knights had initiated over 700 years earlier. Even today, the regional identities on both sides of the border are haunted by this layered history, where a village might have a German name in the history books and a Polish name on the modern map, a silent testament to centuries of shifting control. The commanderies at Lietzen and Rurka may be forgotten ruins, but the borders they helped initiate remain a living and at times contentious reality. Yet this massive confiscation was not the clean slate that kings like Philip might have envisioned. It presented an immense logistical challenge. What does a king actually do with hundreds of castles, thousands of farms, and a continent-spanning network of administrative buildings? The answer, for the most part, was absolutely nothing from scratch. The scale was simply too vast, the existing systems too efficient to dismantle. The new owners, whether rival military orders, ambitious nobles, or the royal treasury itself, discovered that the Templar infrastructure was far too valuable to discard. Why would a Hospitaller knight, suddenly put in charge of a sprawling commandery like Temple Brewer, tear up the meticulously detailed land surveys that showed exactly which fields produced the best wool? Why would a baron, gifted a Templar castle on a strategic river, bother to move the customs house from its perfectly optimal location? There was no incentive to reinvent the wheel when you could simply take the reins of a machine that was already running flawlessly and profitably. This pragmatic continuity is perfectly illustrated by the fate of Templar assets in France. King Philip, after his brutal crackdown, didn't hold onto all the properties himself. A great many, particularly the network of commanderies, were formally transferred by papal decree to their longtime rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. On paper, this was a monumental shift in ownership. In practice, it was little more than a change of management. The same brothers who had managed the day-to-day operations often stayed in place, now swearing allegiance to a new order. The same farmers paid their rents to the same estate managers, who now sent the proceeds to Hospitaller headquarters instead of a Templar treasurer. The physical boundaries of the estates, so carefully marked by hedgerows, stone walls, and ancient oak trees, remained utterly unchanged. The Hospitallers inherited not just land, but an entire prefabricated system of territorial control, and they had the good sense to leave it well enough alone. The invisible borders the Templars had drawn through their economic and administrative activities were thus frozen in place, preserved under a new name. This pattern repeated across Europe. In England, King Edward II was initially hesitant to follow Philip's lead, but political pressure eventually forced his hand. The dissolution there was less violent but just as thorough. Vast Templar estates were seized by the crown, yet rather than breaking them up, the royal administration largely kept them intact as coherent units, recognizing them as efficient revenue-generating assets. Many were eventually sold or granted to loyal nobles, who, again, saw no reason to alter the successful existing framework. The boundaries of these former Templar properties gradually became woven into the fabric of English local government, evolving into the borders of parishes and hundreds that are still recognized today. A similar story unfolded in Portugal, where the king simply created a new order, the Order of Christ, and funneled all the Templar assets into it, ensuring a seamless transition that preserved the order's role in securing the nation's borders. The dissolution, therefore, was not an erasure. It was a massive continent-wide project of inheritance, The Templars were gone, but the geographical and administrative skeleton they had built was kept on by its new owners, providing a ready-made framework that would be used for centuries to come as the map of Europe slowly settled into its modern form. Managing such a sprawling and diverse empire required more than just military might and financial acumen. It demanded a revolutionary grasp of geography and a systematic way of representing it. The Templars, in their relentless drive for efficiency, became pioneers in the nascent science of cartography. Their need to navigate between commanderies from Scotland to Jerusalem, to administer estates spread across different kingdoms, and to accurately record the boundaries of their vast landholdings pushed them to create some of the most detailed and functional maps of the medieval period. These were not the beautiful, symbolic mappamundi designed for church walls, depicting a spiritual vision of the world. These were working documents, practical tools for management and logistics, drawn on parchment and stored in chests, their value measured in their utility, not their artistry. The innovation in these maps lay in their purpose-driven precision. While they may seem crude to our eyes, they introduced concepts that were nothing short of revolutionary for their time. A Templar map of a region like Languedoc in southern France wouldn't just show a drawing of a castle, it would attempt to convey distance and relationship. They developed a rudimentary sense of scale, understanding that the space between a commandery and a river crossing needed to be represented consistently. Orientation was key for their traveling brothers. Many of their route maps would include a simple windrose or compass point, often aligning with the actual direction a knight would travel, making them incredibly practical for navigation. But perhaps their most significant contribution was in boundary marking. Their estate surveys are filled with maps that painstakingly delineate property lines, using a combination of sketches and written descriptions to leave no doubt about where one holding ended and another began. This practice of meticulous land surveying created an invaluable repository of geographical knowledge. Each preceptory maintained its own archives, filled with charts that showed the extent of its fields, the paths of its roads, and the locations of its mills and streams. Over generations, this accumulated into a vast, decentralized library of the European landscape. When the Order was dissolved, this treasure trove of practical cartography did not simply vanish. These documents, along with the lands they described, were seized by royal authorities. For a king seeking to consolidate his power and truly understand the resources of his realm, these Templar archives were a godsend. They provided a baseline of truth, a detailed inventory of territories that had previously been only loosely understood by the central crown. The case of Languedoc is a perfect example. This region, with its complex web of loyalties and histories, was a challenge for the French monarchy to integrate. When royal cartographers began the arduous task of mapping the kingdom for administrative and tax purposes in the later medieval period, they turned to the best available sources. Among the most reliable were the old Templar surveys held in the archives of the Knights Hospitaller, who had inherited them. These documents provided coordinates, listed landmarks, and described boundaries with a clarity that local feudal records often lacked. The lines the Templars had drawn to manage their own estates became, in many instances, the foundational data points for defining the internal borders of the French state itself. The Order's practical need to manage property had inadvertently provided the technical blueprint for modern border making. This cartographic legacy demonstrates that the Templars' contribution was not merely about drawing lines on parchment. It was about advancing a whole philosophy of territorial management. They helped shift the conception of land from a vague zone of influence, controlled through personal loyalty and muscle, to a defined, measurable, and administrable asset. Their maps were the physical manifestation of this idea, proving that space could be rationally understood, divided, and controlled on paper long before it was fully mastered on the ground. This intellectual framework, encoded in their surveys and charts, was perhaps their most enduring gift to the emerging nation-states of Europe, providing them with the conceptual tools needed to transform a patchwork of feudal territories into a coherent, mappable modern country. The seismic shifts of the 16th and 17th centuries didn't just alter the religious map of Europe, they fundamentally redefined the very concept of territory itself. The Protestant Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther's challenges to church authority, and the devastating religious wars that followed, created a continent-wide crisis of faith that inevitably spilled over into a crisis of land and belonging. In this new world where a person's allegiance could be to a Protestant prince or a Catholic king, the old idea of Christendom as a unified spiritual territory with the Pope at its head shattered into 1,000 pieces. This fragmentation had a direct and dramatic impact on the vast network of properties once owned by religious orders like the Templars. As the conflict between Protestant and Catholic powers intensified, the lands and buildings that had been dedicated to God's work for centuries were suddenly seen through a new, secular lens, as strategic assets, sources of revenue, and tools for building state power. This process, known as secularization, was the great unraveling of the medieval world order. Kings and princes, desperate to fund their armies and consolidate their authority, looked upon the wealthy estates of the church not as holy ground, but as a vast, untapped reservoir of wealth and real estate. The religious context that had once sanctified these places was stripped away, but crucially, the physical and administrative structures were not. The very footprints of these properties, the stone walls of a commandery, the carefully surveyed boundaries of a farm, the well-documented charters defining its extent remained intact. They were simply transferred from a religious hierarchy to a state one. A Templar outpost that had once answered to a distant Grand Master in Jerusalem now answered to a royal tax collector in London or Paris. The sacred purpose was gone, but the territorial skeleton was preserved, ready to be grafted onto the emerging body of the modern secular state. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic and systematic than in England under the forceful rule of King Henry VIII. His break with the Catholic Church and his subsequent dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 was one of the largest transfers of land and wealth in English history. This included all the former Templar properties that had been held by the Knights Hospitaller for over 2 centuries. Overnight, these ancient estates were confiscated by the Crown. Henry's motivation was multifaceted: a need to fill his coffers, a desire to reward his loyal nobles, and a strategic aim to break the power of any institution that might owe allegiance to Rome. The result was a fire sale of epic proportions, with vast tracts of land sold off to a new class of gentry and aristocracy. But this wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. The Tudor state was nothing if not bureaucratic. As they took possession of these lands, royal officials relied heavily on the existing administrative records. They pored over the old Templar and Hospitaller charters, surveys, and boundary descriptions. Why would they start from scratch when the previous owners had already done the painstaking work of defining exactly what they owned? The meticulously described borders of a place like Temple Brewer, with its ancient oak trees and Roman road markers, were not erased. They were simply copied into a new ledger, now labeled as Crown property. When the kingdom later underwent a process of formalizing its own internal governance, creating the system of counties and parishes that we would recognize today, these inherited boundaries proved incredibly useful. The outline of a Templar estate, once drawn to separate the order's sacred wealth from the secular world, now became the outline of a civil parish, a purely administrative unit of the English state. The border had completed its journey from sacred to profane, its religious meaning forgotten but its physical reality more entrenched than ever. This pattern repeated across a Europe torn apart by the 30 Years' War and other conflicts. A Templar commandery in Lutheran Germany might be converted into a regional administrative office for a local duke. A fortified church in France, once a hospitaller stronghold, could be garrisoned by royal troops to secure a border against a rival Catholic power, demonstrating that secularization was not a purely Protestant phenomenon. The very nature of borders was evolving. They were no longer just the lines between different faiths, Catholic and Protestant, Christian and Muslim. They were becoming the lines between sovereign states, defined by treaties, armies, and cold political calculation. The repurposed Templar outposts, with their strategic locations and durable construction, were perfectly suited to this new world. Their stones, once meant to defend pilgrims, were now used to collect customs duties or to house soldiers guarding a political frontier. The land itself held the memory of its past purpose, even as it served a new, secular master, allowing the silent influence of the Templars to seep ever deeper into the geography of a modernizing Europe. This medieval playbook for managing distant and hostile territories, perfected by the Templars along the edges of Christendom, did not gather dust in forgotten archives. Instead, it became an implicit guide, a deeply ingrained set of strategies that European explorers and colonizers carried with them as they set sail for entirely new worlds. The men who led these ventures were often from the noble and military classes, the very same strata of society that had been steeped in the legends and histories of the crusading orders for centuries. They were familiar with the concept of landing on a foreign shore, establishing a fortified beachhead, and using it as a nucleus to control the surrounding land and its people. The Templar model of the commandery, a self-sufficient hub of military, economic, and religious power, was a template that proved astonishingly adaptable to the realities of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. It was a system designed for expansion into unknown lands, and that is precisely how it was used again. Nowhere is this echo more clear than in the Spanish presidio system that stretched across the vast frontiers of their New World empire. A presidio was far more than a simple fort. It was a direct descendant of the Templar commandery, a multi-purpose institution designed to secure a volatile border. Just like a Templar stronghold in the Holy Land, a presidio was strategically placed to dominate a key trade route, a river crossing, or a mountain pass. Its garrison provided security, allowing settlers to fan out into the surrounding area, but its role extended far beyond the military. It was an administrative center, a place where laws were enforced and taxes were collected. It was often an economic engine, regulating trade with indigenous populations and protecting the flow of silver and other riches back to the coast. And invariably, at its heart, was a church or mission, underscoring the fusion of spiritual and temporal conquest. This replication of the Templar formula, military power, economic control, and religious mission operating from a single, fortified node, shows how a medieval framework was effortlessly scaled to manage a global empire. The Portuguese, too, applied this networked model with brilliant success, particularly in their string of trading forts along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. A place like Fort Jesus in Mombasa, Kenya, wasn't just a lonely Portuguese outpost. It was one link in a global chain. Much like the Templar network that connected London to Jerusalem, these Portuguese fortresses were designed to be interconnected, supporting each other with supplies, troops, and information. They controlled the sea lanes, the maritime equivalent of the old pilgrim roads, securing the flow of spices, silk, and slaves back to Lisbon. The entire operation was a commercial enterprise wrapped in a military shell, a direct parallel to the Templars' dual identity as warrior monks and financial innovators. The conceptual leap from a Templar preceptory managing trade routes in Provence to a Portuguese feitoria managing the spice trade in Goa is not a large one. It is the same system applied to a new map. This colonial adoption of the Templar model fundamentally globalized a medieval European concept of borders, the idea that a frontier could be secured and a territory claimed by planting a series of fortified, economically active nodes in the landscape became a standard tool of imperialism. The British in North America built a chain of forts along the Appalachian Mountains to define the limits of their settlement and control trade with Native American nations. The French did the same along the Mississippi and St. Lawrence rivers. These weren't just military barriers. They were intended to be centers of influence that would gradually draw the surrounding land into the colonial sphere, exactly as Templar commanderies had done centuries earlier. The borders that eventually emerged from this process, often arbitrary straight lines drawn on maps in distant European capitals, were nonetheless imposed upon a landscape that had first been organized and controlled through this inherited system of strongholds. The ghost of the Templar network, a web of points and lines, had been projected onto the entire globe, demonstrating that the tools for building an empire are often forged long before the empire itself is even imagined. For centuries, the full story of the Templars' role in shaping borders lay buried, not just in forgotten archives, but literally beneath the earth. Written records can be lost, altered, or misinterpreted, but stone and mortar tell a more stubborn, tangible truth. Modern archaeology has become our most powerful tool for uncovering this physical evidence, allowing us to see with our own eyes how these commanderies functioned as the de facto border markers of their day. Through meticulous excavation, the subtle language of territorial control is being translated, revealing boundary walls that defined property lines, the foundations of custom posts where tolls were collected, and the strategic placements that made these sites impossible to ignore. This isn't about finding treasure, it's about reconstructing a lost geography of power, one shovelful of soil at a time. Take, for instance, the ongoing archaeological work at Templar sites on the island of Cyprus. After the fall of the Holy Land, Cyprus became the new frontline for the Order, a crucial Christian outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. Excavations at commanderies like Colossi Castle are revealing a complex picture of how they managed this volatile frontier. Beyond the impressive keep, archaeologists have unearthed the remains of extensive sugar cane processing plants, a major economic operation. But more importantly, they've mapped the entire complex, revealing how its layout was designed for total control. Its position wasn't chosen for a pretty view. It commanded the coastal road, the main artery for trade and military movement. The castle's design, with its thick walls and strategic sightlines, wasn't just about defense against a siege. It was about projecting authority over every person and every cart that passed through its sphere of influence, effectively policing the border between the Christian-controlled interior and the ever-present threat from the sea. This architectural influence didn't end with the Templars. The physical footprint they left on the landscape became a textbook for future empires. The Venetians, who later controlled Cyprus, didn't start from scratch when they fortified the island against the expanding Ottoman Empire. They looked at the existing Templar and Hospitaller strongholds, recognized their strategic genius, and built upon them. They reinforced the same points of control, often using the original foundations. Then, when the Ottomans themselves conquered the island, they did the very same thing. They understood that the Templars had already identified the most logically defensible and economically valuable positions. The continuous use of these sites, layer upon layer of history, cemented their role as permanent fixtures on the map. The border itself might have shifted over the centuries, but the key points for controlling it remained stubbornly constant, dictated by the unchangeable facts of geography that the Templars had been the first to master and monumentally build upon. Perhaps the most telling finds are the smallest and most mundane. While grand castles speak of military might, it's the discovery of things like a carefully laid stone wall separating two fields, or a small, fortified gatehouse on a remote trail that truly reveals the Templars' day-to-day role as border administrators. These are the physical remnants of the boundaries described in their charters. An excavated customs post with its small rooms and strategic placement at a river ford confirms the written records of them levying tolls. The distribution of everyday artifacts like distinctive pottery or coin hoards found around a commandery can literally map out its economic reach, showing how far its influence extended into the surrounding countryside. This is the material basis of their legacy, not a single dramatic find, but a cumulative picture of relentless, organized, and efficient territorial management that left an indelible mark on the very soil of Europe and the Levant. Each of these discoveries is a silent witness, providing corroborating evidence that grounds our narrative in undeniable physical reality, connecting the dots between crumbled medieval stonework and the lines we see on modern maps. So how does such a profound influence simply vanish from the history books? The answer lies in a perfect storm of historical amnesia, where a dramatic ending, shifting priorities, and the slow, silent nature of change all conspired to erase the architects from the blueprint. The most immediate cause was, of course, the Order's sudden and brutal dissolution in the early 14th century. King Philip IV of France didn't just disband the Templars, he launched a vicious propaganda campaign to demonize them, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and all manner of secret crimes. This character assassination was devastatingly effective. In the public mind, the Order was not just gone, it was disgraced, its name soiled, and its achievements tainted. To later generations, they became figures of dark legend and whispered conspiracy, not serious subjects for the study of statecraft and geography. Their respectable legacy was buried under a mountain of scandal and salacious myths, making it almost impossible for centuries to view their administrative work with clear, scholarly eyes. This erasure was then compounded by the overwhelming historical narratives that followed. The centuries after the Templars' fall were dominated by two colossal movements that reshaped how people thought about the world: the rise of the sovereign nation-state and the intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment. The new, powerful kingdoms of France, Spain, and England were busy writing their own origin stories, narratives that emphasized the glory of kings and the inevitable triumph of the central state. They had no interest in sharing credit with a disbanded religious order that had been condemned as heretical. The story of how a nation's borders were formed became a story of royal decrees, famous battles, and grand treaties, the stuff of palaces and parliaments, not of obscure monastic knights managing distant farms. Later, Enlightenment thinkers looked back at the medieval period as a superstitious, dark age, a time of chaos to be overcome by reason and progress. The intricate, pragmatic system of the Templars didn't fit this new worldview. It was seen as a relic of a backward time, unworthy of serious study in an age obsessed with new beginnings and rational design. Perhaps the most subtle reason for this oversight is the nature of borders themselves. Their formation is rarely a single, dramatic event, but a glacially slow process of accumulation and acceptance. The Templar contribution was not a sudden stroke of genius, but a gradual seepage into the bedrock of the landscape. Think of it like a river carving a canyon. You don't notice the change day to day. It's only after centuries that you look down and see the profound, enduring channel that has been created. The Templars established a system of boundaries and routes that worked so well, it was simply adopted by everyone who came after. Their careful surveys became the county lines, their fortified trade routes became the king's highways, their commanderies became the sites of royal customs houses. Their work was so thoroughly absorbed into the infrastructure of daily life that it became anonymous, like the forgotten foundation of a house that has been remodeled again and again. The users of the house never think about the foundation, they just know the floors are solid. For generations, people lived within the borders the Templars helped shape without ever knowing why they were there. The reawakening began in the 19th and 20th centuries, fueled by two powerful forces: the intense fire of modern nationalism and the meticulous tools of professional historical scholarship. As nations solidified their identities, there was a renewed hunger to understand every root of the national territory, to prove its ancient and rightful existence. Historians and archaeologists began digging through dusty archives and excavating old sites, not for treasure but for evidence. They started to cross-reference royal land grants with old parish boundaries, to overlay medieval maps onto modern ones, and to study the architectural remains of commanderies in the context of the surrounding landscape. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to connect the dots. They realized that the peculiar kink in a county line in England perfectly followed the outline of a former Templar estate described in a 700-year-old charter. They saw that a modern border dispute in the Pyrenees was actually a replay of a medieval agreement brokered by a Templar preceptor. The puzzle pieces, scattered and ignored for centuries, were finally being assembled, revealing a picture that had been hidden in plain sight all along. This delayed recognition is a powerful reminder that history is not just about the loud, dramatic events, but about the quiet, persistent currents that move beneath the surface, shaping our world in ways we only understand long after the fact. This remarkable persistence of medieval geography in our modern world isn't just a curious historical footnote. It's a living, breathing reality that continues to shape international relations and even spark conflicts today. If you were to trace the winding border between Israel and Lebanon with your finger on a map, you are, in several key sections, also tracing the ghostly outline of a frontier once patrolled by Templar knights. Their formidable strongholds, like the famous fortress at Atlet on the coast, weren't just isolated castles. They were the anchors of a defensive system designed to control access and movement along a volatile frontier between the Crusader states and their Muslim neighbors. The strategic logic that guided their placement, commanding a coastal road, controlling a mountain pass, dominating a fertile valley, remained just as relevant centuries later. When the French and British mandates carved up the Ottoman Empire after World War I, they often used these enduring geographical and historical realities as a guide. The borders they drew, which would later become the international boundaries of new nations like Israel and Lebanon, frequently followed these ancient fault lines of control, inadvertently preserving the strategic vision first implemented by the Templars. Zooming into the internal map of a country like France reveals an even more pervasive, if subtler, influence. The intricate patchwork of its departments and older regional boundaries didn't appear out of thin air during the French Revolution. Many of these internal administrative lines quietly follow the much older boundaries of medieval fiefdoms, bishoprics, and, crucially, the vast estates of military orders. A river that once marked the edge of a Templar agricultural estate might now form the border between two modern French departments. A forest that was carefully surveyed and documented as Templar property centuries ago could now be the exact point where one regional administration's responsibility ends and another's begins. This isn't a coincidence, it's a testament to bureaucratic inertia and the enduring value of good, clear documentation. The revolutionary officials tasked with redrawing France's internal map for a new, rational age often found themselves relying on the best available land records, many of which were inherited from the Templars and the Hospitallers who took over their assets. The old boundaries simply worked. They were understood by the local populace and defined by unambiguous natural features, so they were adopted into the new system, carrying a medieval legacy directly into the modern era. This deep embedding of historical layers into our contemporary world often goes entirely unquestioned, which is precisely what makes it so powerful. We accept these borders as natural, permanent fixtures, rarely stopping to consider the centuries of accident, negotiation, and conflict that produced them. A farmer in rural France might tend a field whose boundaries were first set by a Templar surveyor 800 years ago, completely unaware of the history beneath his feet. A diplomat negotiating a minor border adjustment between two European nations might be arguing over a line that originated in a land grant to a long-vanished order of warrior monks. This lack of awareness, however, doesn't make the history irrelevant. In fact, it makes understanding it all the more critical. Recognizing the Templar origins or the medieval roots in general of certain borders provides an invaluable layer of context for modern disputes. It explains why a particular strip of land might be so fiercely contested not for its material value today, but for its deep symbolic and historical significance, a significance that was established and reinforced over countless generations. The long shadow cast by this medieval history is especially compelling because it connects the dusty archives of the past to the high-stakes negotiations of the present. A border dispute in the Balkans or along a contested river valley in the Middle East can often feel irrational to outside observers. But when you understand that the claim being asserted is based on a charter from the 1300s or a treaty witnessed by a Templar official, the motivations suddenly become clearer. It's not about logic, it's about memory, identity, and a deep-seated sense of historical right that is woven into the very land itself. This doesn't justify intractable conflict, but it does help explain it, offering diplomats and historians a crucial key to unlocking disputes that might otherwise seem senseless. The silent, crumbling ruins of a Templar outpost, therefore, are not mere relics. They are active participants in the modern world, their stones continuing to whisper the coordinates of boundaries that still define nations, influence economies, and shape the lives of millions. It's a captivating story, the idea that a secretive order of knights could be the master architects behind the world map we know today. But as with any great tale, the line between history and legend can sometimes blur, and it's crucial to separate the solid ground of fact from the seductive quicksand of fiction. The Templars' role was profound, but it was also profoundly unintentional and far more complex than any simple conspiracy theory would suggest. Popular culture, fueled by novels and sensational documentaries, often casts the Order as omnipotent puppet masters, a shadowy cabal deliberately drawing lines on a map with a grand, centuries-long plan. This romantic vision, while thrilling, fundamentally misunderstands how history actually works. Borders are not the product of a single will, but the messy, accumulated result of countless decisions, accidents, and adaptations made by innumerable people over vast stretches of time. To attribute the modern geopolitical landscape solely to Templar design is to ignore the immense, swirling vortex of economic pressures, shifting royal dynasties, peasant revolts, climatic changes, and pure chance that truly shaped our world. Scholarly research doesn't diminish the Templars' importance. It simply places it in its proper, nuanced context. Historians emphasize that the order was one powerful actor among many on a crowded medieval stage. They were alongside kings and popes, local bishops and rival nobles, wealthy Italian merchant republics and rising urban guilds, all jostling for influence and control. Their impact was often indirect, a byproduct of their own immediate needs rather than a deliberate strategy of nation-building. When they built a fortress on a hill, their goal was to protect a road next year, not to define a national border 500 years from now. When they meticulously surveyed a field, they were concerned with collecting rent this season, not with creating a parish boundary for the 19th century. Their genius lay in their brilliant administrative efficiency and strategic foresight for their own era, not in some prophetic vision of the future. The borders emerged later, almost accidentally, as later generations looked at the durable structures the Templars left behind and found them too useful to change. This isn't to say there isn't a kernel of truth that fuels the more outlandish theories. The Templars were undoubtedly secretive, incredibly wealthy, and operated with a degree of independence that made contemporary kings deeply nervous. Their sudden and shocking dissolution, complete with accusations of heresy and hidden treasures, is the perfect breeding ground for mystery. It's easy to connect these dots into a pattern of hidden knowledge and vast, unseen influence. But a critical examination of the evidence points away from a grand conspiracy and toward a more fascinating reality, the law of unintended consequences. The Templars were building an organization to survive and thrive in the 12th and 13th centuries. They succeeded so well that the framework they created outlasted them by centuries, becoming a hidden skeleton upon which the body of modern Europe was built. Their legacy is not one of secret maps and hidden agendas, but of practical solutions that proved so effective they became permanent. By embracing this more balanced, evidence-based understanding, we don't reduce the Templars' story, we enrich it. It becomes a far more compelling lesson about how history operates in the real world. It shows how the daily, pragmatic work of institutions, managing farms, building roads, keeping records, can have a deeper and more lasting impact than the schemes of any individual king or conqueror. Appreciating their contribution without exaggeration allows us to engage with the actual, archaeological and documentary evidence, to walk the ruins of their commanderies and truly see the fingerprints they left on the landscape. This nuanced perspective doesn't weaken our argument. It grounds it in a credible, historical reality that is, in its own way, more astonishing than any myth. It reveals a truth more powerful than fiction, that the most enduring changes often come from the most unexpected places, from the quiet accumulation of practical choices whose full consequences only echo into view long after their makers are gone. This entire journey through the hidden history of the Templars offers us a powerful lesson, one that humbles our modern sense of control and deliberate planning. We often look at a map and assume its borders are the result of clear, calculated decisions made in grand halls by powerful leaders with a master plan. But the truth is far more fascinating and chaotic. The lines we take for granted are more like a river delta, formed by the countless, incremental deposits of countless events, accidents, and adaptations over centuries. The Templars never sat in a chapter house and plotted the future border between France and Spain. They were simply trying to protect a pilgrim road or maximize the wool yield from their English estates next season. Their genius was in solving the immediate problems of their own time with such effective, durable systems that those solutions became the invisible foundations for a world they could never have envisioned. This reminds us that history is not a straight line drawn by a steady hand, but a messy, unpredictable, and often accidental process where the most enduring legacies are usually the unintended ones. This perspective should fill us with a sense of humility when we consider the geopolitical arrangements of our own era. The nations and borders we argue over, fight for, and assume are permanent are likely just as provisional to future generations as the Crusader states were to us. They are the current, temporary snapshot of a process that is still unfolding, built upon layers of history that we often ignore. Understanding this deep history is not just an academic exercise, it is a crucial tool for navigating the present with wisdom. When we encounter a seemingly intractable border dispute today, looking back at its medieval or even ancient roots can reveal that the conflict isn't really about the resources of the present, but about the deeply ingrained stories, traumas, and identities of the past. The Templar story teaches us that to solve the problems of today, we must first understand the hidden architectures we inherited from yesterday, architectures built for purposes that have long since vanished. Ultimately, this narrative shines a light on the incredible, often overlooked power of institutions. The Templars were an institution, a structured organization with rules, traditions, and a longevity that far outstripped any individual member. It was this institutional character that allowed them to build infrastructures physical, economic, legal, and cartographic that possessed a life of their own. These infrastructures were so well designed, so robust and useful, that they outlived the institution that created them. They were adopted, repurposed, and absorbed by kingdoms, empires, and eventually nation-states, becoming part of the operating system of the modern world. This is the profound irony and the central lesson. The most lasting changes are seldom the product of a single great leader's vision, but rather the accumulated output of organizations working over long periods of time, creating systems that take on a life of their own and shape the future in ways their creators could never have dreamed. The silent, crumbling ruins of a Templar outpost are not just relics, they are monuments to this enduring truth, reminding us that the world we inhabit is built upon the accidental legacies of the past. Imagine standing on the worn stone steps of the Convent of Christ in Tomar, Portugal, feeling the same sun that once warmed the faces of Templar knights who negotiated the very frontiers of a budding nation. This isn't just sightseeing, it's a form of time travel, a chance to physically connect with the landscapes where history's invisible lines were first drawn. Across Europe and the Middle East, these surviving sites serve as open-air classrooms, offering a palpable sense of how strategic decisions made centuries ago echo in our modern world. A visit to Temple Church in London, nestled within the city's bustling modern heart, provides a stark contrast. Here, surrounded by skyscrapers, you can trace the outlines of the original round church, a powerful reminder of the Order's vast economic reach and how their once sacred grounds became absorbed into the secular fabric of a nation's capital, their boundaries persisting beneath layers of subsequent development. The true magic of exploring these places lies in understanding their context within the broader region. A trip to the fortress of Atlat in Israel isn't complete without driving the nearby coastal highway. As you journey north toward the Lebanese border, you can see how the castle's commanding position still dominates the landscape, making it instantly clear why medieval and modern strategists both valued this exact same vantage point. In the rolling countryside of Lincolnshire, England, renting a car and driving the back roads around where Temple Brewer once stood reveals a different story. The patchwork of fields and the layout of ancient parish boundaries become a live map, illustrating how the Order's meticulous estate management directly influenced the local administrative divisions that are still in use today. This kind of exploration transforms abstract historical concepts into a tangible, understandable reality, Many of these locations are nestled in areas of stunning natural beauty, offering a dual reward of breathtaking scenery and profound historical insight. The remote commandery of La Couvertoire, perched on the harsh, beautiful plateau of the Larzac in southern France, is surrounded by dramatic courses and deep gorges. Hiking the trails that radiate from its still imposing walls, you can easily imagine Templar patrols monitoring the horizon, their presence defining the edge of controlled territory. Similarly, a visit to the Crac des Chevaliers, though primarily a hospitaller castle, showcases the type of formidable architecture and strategic placement the Templars also mastered. Its location in the Syrian hills demonstrates the sheer scale of the crusading order's ambition to control geographic choke points, a lesson in military geography that feels almost palpable. To make the most of these visits, a little preparation can unlock deeper layers of meaning. Before you go, spend time looking at old maps alongside modern ones. Notice how a contemporary road might curve around an ancient boundary, or how a village seems to cluster near the ruins of a commandery. When you're there, talk to local guides and residents. In places like Tomar, the pride in the Templar legacy is woven into the local identity, and their stories can provide color and context you won't find in any guidebook. This hands-on approach does more than just teach history. It fosters a new way of seeing the world around us. You begin to understand that a border is rarely just a line imposed by politicians. It is often the result of slow, accumulated history of a river that was easy to ford, a mountain that was hard to cross, or a castle that was too powerful to ignore. Returning home from such a journey, you'll likely find yourself looking at your own local landscape with fresh, more curious eyes. You might start to question why a county line takes a sudden zigzag, or why an old road follows such a peculiar route. This newfound mindfulness reveals that history is not confined to textbooks. It is embedded in the very soil and stone around us, waiting for anyone willing to look a little closer and ask the right questions. This engagement with the physical remnants of the past empowers us to become active participants in understanding our world, connecting our own stories to the grand, unfolding narrative of human geography. So as we reach the end of our journey, it's worth pausing to consider the profound irony at the heart of this entire story. The Knights Templar, an order founded with a singular, sacred purpose to protect pilgrims in a distant Holy Land, ultimately became the unlikely architects of something entirely secular and modern, the very map of our world. They were building for the immediate future, for the next crusade, the next harvest, the next trading season. They had no grand design to shape nations yet to be born. Their legacy is a powerful testament to the enduring, often invisible, power of infrastructure. It shows us that the most permanent changes to our world are seldom the product of a single great leader's vision, but rather the accumulated output of systems economic, legal, architectural, that are built to last and are simply too useful to discard, even long after their original purpose has been forgotten. This hidden history challenges us to look at our world with new eyes, to develop a deeper curiosity about the origins of the things we take for granted. The next time you glance at a map, whether on your phone or a folded paper atlas, remember that those confident lines are not as deliberate as they appear. They are palimpsests layered with the ghostly handwriting of history. A river border might exist because a Templar commandery once controlled its ford. A straight line through a forest might follow the boundary of a long-vanished monastic estate. This perspective invites a sense of wonder into our daily lives, transforming a simple act like crossing a county line into a momentary connection with a deep and complex past. It reminds us that history is not a dry subject confined to textbooks, but a living force etched into our landscapes and silently guiding our present. Ultimately, the story of the Templars and our borders is a lesson in humility. It cautions us against the arrogance of believing we fully control our own destiny or that our modern arrangements are permanent. The nations we live in, the frontiers we defend, are temporary snapshots in an endless process of change, built upon foundations laid by people who could never have imagined our world. Understanding this doesn't diminish our present, it enriches it, providing crucial context for the conflicts and connections that define our time. By acknowledging these deep historical currents, we gain a wiser, more nuanced understanding of our place in the long flow of history. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating hidden chapter with me. If this journey through the echoes of the past has intrigued you, feel free to like this video, subscribe for more content, and share your own thoughts and discoveries in the comments below.